Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue our discussion on point-to-site VPN by discussing the variety of authentication options that are available, including the different compatibility combinations. In this lesson, we're going to start off with a quick overview of the different configurations options available, and then we are going to expand the two main topics we're going to focus on, which is going to be point-to-site VPN tunnel types, which can also be referred to as protocols, and also point-to-site VPN authentication methods. And then we're going to wrap up by taking a look at the different compatibilities between our tunnel types authentication methods and different operating systems just to make things a bit more fun. Let's go ahead and jump on into it. So when discussing the different configuration options available with point-to-site VPN, there are two main categories that we're going to take a look at. They are tunnel types, often referred to as protocols, and at a glance, those three tunnel types are OpenVPN, Secure Socket Tunneling Protocol, or SSTP for short, and IKE version 2. In addition to our tunnel types or protocols, we also have three different authentication methods. That is the method that our end client is going to use to authenticate with our Azure point-to-site VPN. And those authentication methods are certificate-based authentication, Azure AD, and using a Radius server. Now, what's going to be a primary focus of this lesson and also going to be an exam objective is discussing the different compatibilities of tunnel types and authentication methods, which also include operating system compatibility as well. Let's go ahead and break each of these down, starting with point-to-site VPN tunnel types, or again, protocols as a different term. As mentioned in the previous slide, we have three different tunnel types available, which again include OpenVPN, Secure Socket Tunneling Protocol, or SSTP, and again, IKE version 2. Let's go ahead and expand on each one of these. Expanding on each of these, starting with OpenVPN. OpenVPN is referred to as an open standard, which supports all the major operating systems, which include Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, and iOS mobile devices. Of our three different tunnel types, OpenVPN by far has the widest compatibility with all the major operating systems. Our next tunnel type is SSTP, which compared to OpenVPN, which is an open standard, SSTP is by contrast a proprietary standard which only works with Windows operating systems. And then finally, our last tunnel type is IKE version 2, which is a standards-based IPsec VPN solution. From a pure protocol perspective, this is most similar to the same method that our site-to-site VPN uses, which is also IPsec in IKE version 2. And from a support or compatibility perspective, it has almost the same range of compatibility with OpenVPN, which includes Windows 10 operating systems and newer. So in other words, older versions of Windows up to Windows 8 do not support IKE version 2. From a Windows Server perspective, it is supported on Windows Server 2016 and newer, and it also supports the other major operating systems, including macOS, Linux, and Android as well. Moving on, let's take a look at the other configuration options, which is our different point-to-site VPN authentication methods. Again, as a quick review, those three authentication methods include certificate-based authentication, Azure AD, and Radius server. Let's expand on each one of those in more detail, starting with a certificate. When talking about certificate, we are discussing native Azure certificate-based authentication, which is generated from a trusted root certificate. With certificate-based authentication, once you upload your trusted certificate into Azure, you then need to install or download that certificate configuration on each client computer, which is going to connect to our point-to-site VPN. And as we mentioned in the previous lesson, and we're going to talk about in some more detail in our troubleshooting lesson, if using certificate-based authentication in conjunction with network peering, every time you add a remote network peer to your VPN hosting network, you are required to re-download that certificate authentication. You will be required to re-download your certificate configuration to each end client every time you add a new virtual network peering. Moving on to our Azure AD authentication method, not surprisingly, it is used to authenticate with Azure AD credentials, which is really useful for different Microsoft 365 environments which use Azure AD in the background. From a requirements perspective, Azure AD requires a separately downloaded and installed Azure VPN client, which is then used to configure and manage our Azure AD authenticated connection. From a tunnel type perspective, it works only with the OpenVPN protocol, and from an operating system perspective, it is supported only on Windows and Mac computers. You're not able to use Azure AD authentication with mobile devices or Linux machines as well. Quick side note, Mac OS is a recent addition of working with Azure AD. Some older training materials out there may state that Azure AD works with Windows only, which was certainly accurate. However, sometime in 2021, Mac was added as an Azure AD authentication method with the addition of the Azure VPN client added to the Mac App Store. Our last authentication method is that of a Radius server, which is used to integrate with enterprise levels or larger existing Active Directory environments. Again, this is not used for integrating with Azure AD, but for really traditional on-premises Active Directory implementations. And not surprisingly, Radius Server Authentication is ideal for existing Radius deployments, although in my opinion, I would not create a Radius deployment if you do not already have an on-premises Active Directory environment that already exists. It is typically recommended for existing Active Directory and Radius Server implementations. Last thing I want to take a look at is a large at-a-glance view of all the different compatibilities we need to be familiar with, which include operating systems, authentication methods, and the tunnel types or protocols which are available for each configuration option. Now, I'm not going to make you memorize this entire chart. One thing I did want to point out is that when it comes to the widest amount of compatibility possible, notice that OpenVPN has the widest range of compatibility. In fact, the only configuration where OpenVPN is not possible is specifically with Windows Server 2008 configurations, which can only use the SSTP protocol. Which means, especially from an exam-taking perspective, if you're being tested on a specific protocol compatibility configuration and you just simply don't remember what the answer is, chances are very good OpenVPN is going to be the correct answer. With that, that's going to go ahead and wrap up our overview of the different tunnel types and authentication methods available when using Azure Point-to-Site VPN. Let's go ahead and review our key takeaways before moving on. We start off with a quick glance of the different configurations options available, which include different combinations of tunnel types and authentication methods. From there, we looked at our 3 tunnel types, which include OpenVPN, SSTP, which is again Windows only, and IKE version 2. And we also looked at our 3 different point-to-site authentication methods, which include certificate-based authentication, Azure AD authentication, and Radius servers. And then finally, we took a big picture view of the different compatibilities between different tunnel types, authentication methods, and operating systems, in which we covered there is an exam expectation that you should be familiar which tunnel type can be used with which different authentication methods and operating system as well. From which we also discussed that if you simply can't remember the answer, OpenVPN is the most compatible, and it is a good, safe choice to go with. That's going to go ahead and wrap this lesson up. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.